So welcome back. The sort of part two. So if part one looks at the very kind of black letter issue of what kind of physical intimacies are and aren't and can and should and shouldn't be permitted, put up with, celebrated, prohibited, all those kinds of things. This session is about how do you support people in a sort of monogamous, committed kind of a place. And this, in terms of my own journey, has been the biggest question, which is that, if you want to say to someone who is only going to be attracted to someone of the same sex, fine, I get that, I'm fine with that. What do you then provide for them as a pathway? One option is to say, whatever you want to do it privately, and don't bring it into the synagogue, don't bring it into the religious realm. And I think that you can be very supportive of governmental decisions to give same-sex partners next of kin rights and the ability to understand what's going on, God forbid, in a hospital environment when one person has suffered some horrible accident. Can the other person be part of that decision-making process? Inheritance tax. You can be very in favour of a whole kind of raft of civil, legal, equality kinds of issues, and still feel that you don't want to do anything religiously to support, celebrate, mark, strengthen that. That this kind of phrase of Bet Ne'eman B'Yisrael, a faithful house in Israel, which is one of the things that you say to a straight couple, just can't be said to a couple who's gay. Lesbian, queer, language is tricky. But I'm interested in that. The other thing that's kicking around for me, partly separately to that, but partly linked to that, are questions around the nature of heterosexual marriage. Because, as we'll see, there's a major sort of issue with heterosexual marriage, which has implications for what may or may not end up becoming normative for gay and lesbian couples. So what I've done is produce some texts that get at this sort of larger question of what is marriage, and what should we be doing in the name of marriage, right, for anybody, and then out of that understand something about some of the possibilities that are kicking around in the same-sex world. Any sort of questions about that? Part of what's driving this is that sense that if you define marriage, I think I mentioned this last week, if you define marriage as the union of man and woman before God, well then of course you can't do anything for people who are gay because it's not man and woman. But that just becomes a sort of a circular argument. It depends how you define it. So we're going to sort of swim around some of these sort of Jewish places. And where I thought would be a really interesting place to start would be Maimonides. Because one of the things that you will regularly find early on in one of the sort of Hilchot whatevers in Maimonides is, back in the old days it used to be this, and then we did this. So and Maimonides will very often give you a kind of a conceptual understanding of what any particular mitzvah happens to be about, and particularly on the subject of prayer. Back in the old days we used to do sacrifice, and then we got this, then we did that, and now we do the other. But actually, I thought, as I encountered this, which is from the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Yeshut, from the major legal code of Maimonides, I thought this really kind of helped me understand some stuff that I hadn't really thought about in this way before. Would someone just care to share it in the English? This is the very opening of Hilchot Yeshut.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Before the giving of the Torah, there would be, if someone happened upon a woman in the marketplace and they wanted to marry her, he would bring her into his house and consummate a marriage between them privately, but she would be his wife. Okay,
just pause there for a second. The key phrase that I want, I love, the two things I want to share in the Hebrew. Pogea isha bashuk. Literally bumped into a woman in the market, right? I don't know, what would be that today? Nowadays, of course, it's all gone online. But, it used to be like, you're in a pub, and boom, there she is. Whoa, fancy a bit of that. And then this, and I've bolded this so you can just see it in the Hebrew, Beino levein atzmo, which means, between himself and between himself. Right? That's translated as in private, which is a perfectly fine thing to do. But that's to say that in the old, before Matan Torah world, connubium, to use the Roman legal phrase, meant a private deal. Nobody was involved. Nobody got to see it. And the image that just arises in my mind is that kind of great caveman image. You grab her by the hair, you drag her into the cave. And by the way, look who, and this won't be a surprise to any of us. Look who's doing the the initiation of all this. Although, just again, the Hebrew is very interesting, and I don't quite know how to translate this perfectly. Im ratza hu v'hi lisaota. If he wanted and she to marry her, that's the literal translation. But I think it means like. I think that does suggest, at the very least, consent, right? Imratzahu v'hi. If he wanted her and she wanted him, I think you can kind of translate it like that. But I don't quite understand where he got that Hebrew from. I should probably sort of just understand a bit better this sort of the thing that's built off. Yeah. Okay.
Once the Torah was given, Israel was commanded if a man wanted to marry a woman, he would acquire her first through witnesses, and afterwards she would be his wife. As it says, so the man takes a woman and sleeps with her.
Pause there. Okay. Now Torah comes along, and the first key word here is nitztavu, mitzvah. Don't worry about that text, that's just grammar. That we now have a mitzvah. By the way, what should we be expecting any time that you read in Mishnah Torah and nitztavu, or there was a mitzvah? What would you expect Maimonides to then come up with?
Either a negative word or a positive.
Okay, well, this is clearly a positive one, isn't it? But a biblical verse. Sorry, I was overly fishy. Maimonides. Any time that Maimonides says that there is a mitzvah, certainly at this point, he's got to come up with a biblical verse. Okay, we'll see what his biblical verse. Now, if a man wants to marry a woman, yikneota, keyword, kana. Was that the door? We'll hear this word a lot today. The word kinyan. Koner means to take acquisition of something. So just hold that, and we'll circle around the sort of gender critique on this. Yikne ota techila, before you drag her into the cave, before the moment of private intimacy, comes the act of kinyan, comes the act of acquisition, and the act of acquisition needs to be bifnei edim, before witnesses. And that suggests, I think, in my mind, two things. One is, it's somehow public. That the act of marriage, instead of becoming beino levein atzmo, between themselves, a private thing, becomes something which is done publicly. And the other thing is, witnesses by definition are fine, upstanding people. The technical. You can't be a witness if you race doves, or if you play dice, or you've got to be of impeachable character. You should certainly be Shabbos observant. In other words, when you call witnesses in, you are. It's not just two guys. It's not like the wedding chapel in Las Vegas, right, where you can just drag somebody in off the street to be a witness. It needs to be proper. And now this biblical verse, Ki yikach ish isha uva aleha. Literal translation: when a man takes a woman and comes to sleep with her. By the way, the rest of the verse is not going to help you. It doesn't really look like a mitzvah in the way, as in you should do this, right? Ki, you would probably translate this as if, but here Maimonides is translating this as a obligation, and there's no better way of explaining the witnesses bit, or the proof that you need witnesses, as in, how do you know that Moshe wore a stromal? Well, you think he'd go out with that, his stromal on? It's that kind of proof that this needs to be. In other words, Maimonides is deeming this to be a mitzvah, and he's very interested in procreation and some of those kinds of things, and we can perhaps talk about some of those kinds of issues. But here we have it. Now being given the imprinture of a D'oraita commandment, a Torah mandate. I mean, Dina, we were just talking about this before.
Yeah.
Like, who knows, right? But here we go. It's now called D'oraita. Thank you, Rosemary.
And taking a wife as such is a positive commandment to Torah. The woman is
Okay,
required-
pause here. Now we're going to get a quote, almost literally, from the Mishnah, the opening Mishnah of Kiddushin. Here we go.
And a woman is acquired through three means: money, contract, or through intercourse. Marriage through intercourse or by contract is from the Torah, and by money is reckoned.
Okay. So there are three ways to perform this kinyan. You pay, and it's almost consideration, right? That there needs to be something of value which is done. There needs to be a legal document, and then there is the act of intercourse itself. And let's keep on going.
And this position is what is called Kiddushin or Irithu.
Okay, thank you very much. Kiddushin Kodesh. Very interesting. Kodesh literally means you can't have it. When we talk about God as Kadosh, 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 we mean that God is the ultimate non-havable thing. And Kiddushin in the context of marriage means that nobody can have, let me just use the word partner, but we need to be a bit more specific about that later. Nobody can have the relationship with the partner that you can have. Everybody else is left outside that separated from all other kinds of relationships.
It's exclusive.
Exclusivity. Yes, yes. But it also suggests a certain degree of kind of like a holiness. So that there is a fudge in the human-to-human relationship that gets sprinkled with some holy dust. And that's one of the wonderful things that happens at a wedding.
It's like why they have the consecrated to me according to the Lord.
Yes, exactly. Mekudeshet. Right. It's that root, which there clearly doesn't mean you're God to me. It clearly means that nobody else can have the relationship with you that I am now able to have a relationship with you. And actually, technically, that's exactly what but to happen if it used to be that was done a year before the Sheva Brachot, right? And after saying you are Mekudeshet to me, nobody could ever get married to that woman again. The only person who could ever get married to that woman was that particular groom, which meant that if the relationship got called off before you'd finished the Sheva Brachot, she would need a get. And if the man disappeared, she would be an aguna. She would be stuck.
This exclusivity is one way.
We'll see that later. What Rambam has in mind is one-way exclusivity. That the woman picks up the obligation of sexual monogamy. The man actually doesn't. Right? Those of us who've read. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, we'll get to that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That'll do. Right. Just skip to Mishnah Torah number 4. Oh, foo. Somewhere along this line, there is something is not quite.
Is that relevant? Is that relevant or not? No, I don't think it is. Is that bad?
It needs to be pressed on the one.
On the back?
Yeah, press on the one.
Still no.
There is definitely electricity coming out here. Can you get? This is the next one.
Yay! Phew! Okay. Technology. Thank you, Rosemary. Somebody else. Number 4. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Before the
Sorry.
giving of Torah, if a man bumps into a woman in the shuk, if they wanted one another, he would give her her value and ba'al her by the side of the way.
Okay, let's just pause there and just catch up on this Hebrew. Again, Maimonides is reaching back into ancient history. Pogei isha bashuk, bumps into a woman in the shuk. This slightly strange language, imratza hu v'hi. So this is consensual. Noten la schara. Schar, price. Okay, he'd pay her, uvoelota, and master her. Right? I mean, meaning exactly what you think it is. Al aim derech, by the side of the way, v'holech. Right? So let's see what Maimonides thinks that was.
This was called Kadesha.
Right? And that's Kadesha. Kadesha, I don't know quite what that root has to do with holiness, because that is what the Bible calls a sort of prostitutory, tinged with idolatry kind of thing. Right? The Bible does not like the notion of a Kadesha. We'll see what's how that plays out. Yeah, Dina.
Yeah, we're working off of Yiddish right now. There's a word in Yiddish that is hektish, which means polluted, dirty.
Oh, how interesting.
It's has nothing to do
with the biblical Hebrew hektish. Very nice.
The opposite, but it could be like pharmakon in Greek, which has the meaning of both something that cures you and something that poisons you. I don't know.
We have a lot of things like that in Hebrew, right? The word davek means both to stick together and to cleave apart.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of that stuff. And then you have that rather strange Hebrew thing of using the opposite of something to mean the thing that you don't like. Say, she says, "Boy, did I give him a bracha?" Meaning, did I lay into that person? Right? So, I mean, yeah, exactly. I need that like a mishabra. Yeah. So, I mean, we have a lot of that. But here we go. Right. So, don't. What I'm saying is, don't worry about the root of Kodesh on this. This is the prostitutory arrangement, and we're going to see. That is what happened previously. Let's keep going, Jenny.
I was going to ask you if this is like Judah and Torah.
Exactly. Yes.
When Torah was given, Kadesha was prohibited, as it says, Deuteronomy 23:18. There shall not be a Kadesha among the people of Israel.
Okay. When Torah comes along, stops. I mean, I don't want to get into a universal particularist kind of thing on this, but the Torah does not like this, and it wants it stopped. Therefore,
any who ba'als a woman in the name of Znut without kiddushin is whipped, as the Torah decree.
Right. Znut, harlotry. Zonah, prostitute in contemporary Hebrew. That lovely, very, very interesting line in the 3rd paragraph of the Shema. That you should look at the tzitzit so that you wouldn't go zonah-ing off after whatever your eyes sort of take you. It kind of brings you into a sense of appropriate behavior. In other words, the apparatus of kiddushin and irusin, this kinyan bifnei edim, in front of witnesses, is part of the forbiddenness of the prostitutory arrangements and the private arrangements. In other words, the apparatus of Jewish marriage is about giving a derech, a pathway for an acceptable containing of the need for physical and sexual intimacy.
For Kadesha.
No. It used to be, before Matan Torah, if you fancied her and she was all right with it, you paid her the money, you did whatever you did, and then you went on with your way. Now we've got Torah, says Maimonides, you can't do that. Instead, you should and you have to find a woman, and in this sort of public, sanctified, proper way, you go through this process of Kiddushin, which has long-term implications for you. And and we're not going to see all this coming in tonight, but you've got to put money in escrow that if you break up this relationship, the woman gets a certain amount of money so that she doesn't become economically destitute. It kind of picks up and I think it's not wrong to see this in the context of other things like, for example, kashrut, that there is something about amelioration of the overly animalistic part of humanity, setting it within sort of halakhically appropriate ways, and trying to allow the relationship to be a better relationship rather than a more animalistic relationship. I think that you can understand the origins of heterosexual marriage law in that kind of sense. You have a question, Jenny?
Does it maybe also have something to do with separation from cultures that surround and permeate, as Pascal did?
Right. Right. It depends.
Prostitution occurred all over.
Yes. Although I think, Maimonides is the biggest person in the world about exactly that, ever about that exact idea. This is all about not being like the other nations. But I think here, it's not so much that. It's more about lust, rampant lust, and the way in which that can become sort of a znut kind of a thing. It's 25 past 10. We've been here a while already, I didn't realize. Okay. I don't want to do the next one necessarily in the language. What I'm interested in is this. Every traditional wedding that I've done uses very particular language. Do I have to say this? If you catch me using this language and looking at you, I don't mean you. I love you all, but I'm spoken for, right? So that we use this language, Havarei at mukudeshet li b'tabat zu kadat Moshe v'Yisrael. Behold, I am with this ring, mukudeshet. We've talked about that word, the way that it's clearly about the forbiddenness of all, the exclusivity of the relationship that is created, given a little dusting of holiness, of godliness that comes in there. But there are other languages that are kind of acceptable. You're sanctified to me. You're engaged to me. Mu'aresetli. With this, you are my wife. Havili isha. If you say any of these kinds of words, it kind of works. And then, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to translate this. There are other words that you can use that don't quite work. If you say Harayat ishti, Harayat arusati, or you are my kinuya li, you are my acquisition. I'm down in sort of the middle of Vav. Harayat sheli, interesting, you are mine. Harayat lukuchati, you are my kach, you are what I have taken. Harayat harufati, again, you are my charef. Weird one. Sword. Quite know how to do that. It's clearly coming out from somewhere. But on this, Harayat Barushati. Interesting. Reshut. What's a reshut? You're in a permittance. You are permitted to me. Very interesting, right? We're talking about this forbidden and permitted. You are the one who's permitted to me. Hare zukukali. You are needed by me, and anything like that. That's makudeshet. All of those kinds of phraseologies work. However, if you say muchedetli, special to me, moyedetli, known by me, ezrati, very nice phraseology. Why might you want to say, as you marry someone, you are my Ezer? Adam and Eve, right? Because God creates the original woman as an Ezer Kenegdon, right? Very nice. You could be trying to access something. You are negdati, right? Ezerti and negdati. You are my opposer. My other half, very nice, right? This is the trouble and strife. I think negdati. You're the trouble and strife. Hare at salaati. Sela. From what did God make the first woman?
Hebrew.
Hebrew word? Selah. Right? God took from Adam Selah. Right? You are my segurati. Very nice. Sagur. Closing of me. Wow. Right? You complete me. What's that great movie with
Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise? Tom Cruise. It's Top Gun. No, I thought it was the one with the deaf woman. It's not. Never mind. Right? You complete me. Which one is that? Whatever, top, right? Okay, you are tachtai. You're fine. You're the one underneath me. Yep, this means exactly what you think it means. Atsurati, you are the atsur. You again complete me. You are, all of these kinds of things are mukudeshet besafek. Because you could possibly say any of those things to someone and not mean wife. It's besafek.
It's not sufficiently commitment.
Yeah, you fail to use the fullest language, the proper language. I'll talk more about this later. Kiddushin besafek means it counts as being marriage unless you need it not to. Best example, if the man disappears, you can release the woman from being an agunah because they, or if they have, if she has. You do bump into this. This is really awful. But, man and woman get married, Jewishly, with a civil documentation. They get civilly divorced. Woman remarries, has children in the second marriage. As a matter of halakha, those children of the second marriage are a mamzer because that is an adulterous relationship. It's not an adulterous relationship. But if you got married basafek in the first place, the kids are clearly not going to be a mamzers, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be mukudeshet basafek.
So just to repeat, so you are taken, you are a sword, my sword, you're committed to me. That's kosher. That's like a full marriage.
Yep.
But things like you're a rib to me and you complete me, that's not kosher.
Correct.
Okay.
That's kiddushin basafek.
Okay.
It's doubtful or dubious kiddushin. Just hold that in your mind for a second. I put in here the biblical verse on divorce because I think it's worth just understanding, and the word I like to use for this is the androcentric nature of all of this, by which I mean the male-centeredness of it. I don't think it's right or fair to say that the rabbis were misogynist or sexist. Those words, I think, are just so out of time when used to apply to this. I mean, by the way, are there misogynist rabbis? Yes, but then, that's a slightly different issue. It's just so profoundly male-centered. How do you talk about marriage? A man makes acquisition of a woman in one. A woman is acquired in one of three ways. Or what is marriage? The man goes into the shop, bumps into the woman, and says, "Oh, I like a bit of her," and she consents. It's just profoundly androcentric. But I just want to have this biblical verse around divorce, just so that we can kind of just check in with this. Someone just to do this.
When a man taketh a wife and marrieth her, then it cometh to pass, if she find no favour in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly thing in her, that he write her a bill of divorcement and give it to her in her hand, and send her out of his house. And she departs out of the house and goes and becomes another man's wife.
So again, the man does the acquisition, and therefore the man has to do the releasing. Because the woman is the subject, she's not an object. The woman is betrothed, she doesn't betroth. And actually, I skipped
you skipped that three things, the things that they talk where he has to say it and he has to reflect it. She can't respond.
Right.
She can't do anything.
Right. And actually it's very clear in the Mishnah Torah that if the woman says, you are mukudash to me, that's problematic. Because she can't do that.
But on page 1, there is a whole lot of mutual consent.
She has to consent to being, for want of a better term, acquired.
Oh.
She has to consent to it. And actually, by the way, this is my sense of what the circling is under a chuppah. It's the way that the woman shows that she wants the guy in the middle. Because otherwise you would never know. She's entirely silent. And, you can't see her face. And that is as close as the woman... That's the demonstration of the woman's election. By the way, birds do that. It's ornithological, I'm sure, completely sure. Gulls land, all the males build little nests in the mating ground, and the female gulls come down and they walk round the nest of the gull that they fancy, for want of a better term.
7 times as well.
It's really difficult to count that correctly. Okay.
I've heard you counting with the...
Okay, now, I need to consult with Sigmund Freud as to why when I did this, I wrote Rabbi Joel Roth in this next bit, because it's not Rabbi Joel Roth, it's Rabbi Joel Levy. I've corrected that for the sources that are online, but here we go. Rabbi Joel Levy, British Masorti rabbi, now the director of the Conservative Yeshiva, as well as the rabbi of Kol Nefesh, wrote a really interesting article in a Masorti publication called, I can't remember, it's not called This Is My Beloved, My Friend, something like that. He's got an article in there. I've got an article about what should a gay Jew do in there as well. But this is Joel Roth writing, Joel Levy, writing 5-6 years ago, something like that. Someone just to share this.
Hello?
Go for it.
The halakhic implication of this inequality is that it is only the woman's status that changes substantially when she marries. Only she is liable for the harshest punishments under the law, should she be sexually unfaithful to her husband.
So pause there, right? We've talked a bit about this. The woman is acquired. The woman's status changes. The restrictions apply to the woman. Don't apply to the man. The woman is liable for punishment. The man is not, right? So
wasn't it said before that the man receives his pleasure elsewhere?
yeah, that's harlotry, right? He's engaging in harlotry. True, but what if the man wanted a second wife, or a third wife, or a fifth wife? Right? So men shouldn't behave badly. But that's different from saying that the man's status has been transformed into being somebody who is committed as a matter in front of aid him to be monogamous in the same way that the woman is.
He says you're set aside, you're devoted to me. Don't say I'm devoted to you.
Correct. We are in heated agreement. I thought I was trying to say exactly what you're suggesting. Exactly what you're suggesting.
Every time he gets into trouble, is he takes another woman who's married to somebody else, and then he'll be punished.
Yeah, that's okay.
But that's because the adultery is being engaged in some another married woman.
Another man's property.
That's very nice. Very nice.
But in all the weddings that I've been to from you, the woman also says the whole yoga thought.
Yeah, she does. We'll get there. We'll get there. Okay. Actually, largely because of this article. I mean, this was a very important article for me to encounter. We'll see where he gets to with it. 2005, 6, 7, 8. Not so long ago. 9 maybe. Yeah, Steve.
Given that the central act in a traditionalist Jewish wedding is still an act of acquisition, where money, generally in the form of a ring, passes from the man to the woman, anyone choosing to get married mindfully in this way will need to think through their relationship with tradition itself in a profound manner.
Okay, and that's classic Rabbi Joel Levy stuff, Are you sure that the thing that you're doing genuinely reflects your very inner sense? Joel's. You go and study with Joel. You take your life in your hands. Yeah, let's keep going.
Some scholars have even suggested
this is when he's going to start being very cheeky indeed.
Yeah.
Some scholars have even suggested that a radical change to the wedding ceremony would be necessary in our day. In halakha, in order for kiddushin to be valid, both parties must consent to the contract application. This means that the woman may need to consent to being acquired.
Okay, that seems perfectly reasonable. That we've talked about assent. In other words, in order to do a traditional kiddushin, you need to make sure, nearly Mrs. Cohen, are you happy to be acquired? You need to answer that question yes before we can acquire you.
Is that a question you ask to current brides?
I promise I will tell you what I do.
No, if they want traditional marriage.
I am very cognizant of this, and I promise I will tell you what I'll do.
I heard Joel speak about this, probably the Resulti last year, when he said that there's probably, since if the woman didn't give her consent, active consent, there will be probably the ceremony that was invalid, and therefore there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who will not be with her.
Okay, he still agrees with what he wrote here. So let's just do it here.
Having asked some people who were married quite a few years ago, including me, I don't think a lot of people understand what being in those days being acquired actually meant.
I agree.
They just didn't know. I mean, Rabbi Jacobs, for example, when I said I wanted to say something, he said, "You will shut up, look beautiful, and stand there." So, who was going to ask me what
That's the way we do it.
It was a little bit more restrained than that, but that's the import of his words.
I'm intrigued to hear that. I mean, this goes back, to who was Rabbi Jacobs? Was he even if our mental things have moved on, we still remain conservative in our practice? Or was he the person who said that since we can no longer believe those daft things that are overhangs of an ancient times, we need to be able to move with the times? And just, you've just brought, I mean, it's great to have a Kli Rishon, right? First-hand evidence of that tension playing out in another direction yet again. Alan?
And the other side of that is that one of the last weddings Rabbi Jacobs did when he was very elderly was the daughter of a friend of mine. She got on a horse and said, "I am not walking around that man 7 times." And he said, people started doing that more after figuring out what we were saying. Right? That was the other side.
Very, very so interesting. All right, let's just keep moving down this. So where are we at the moment? We might need a change because the woman should be asked whether or not she's consenting. Let's do a bit more here.
Professor Meir Feldblum
Of Yeshiva University and then Bar Ilan, right? So this is not, it's not Joe Schmo.
Has written in the current implications of the lack of informed consent of women at the time of the marriage.
He basically, he says, if there's no informed consent,
as in all the historical marriages,
you got a big problem here. It might be pasul. Or we got a problem.
Might be, what's the word?
Keep going.
What's that thought? Anyway, even worse, if the woman does indeed know the meaning of the ceremony and states explicitly beforehand that she does not believe in or accept the nature of kiddushin.
I've just extracted the bit that Joel says here, which happens to me all the time, says Joel, right?
What does that do to the validity of the wedding ceremony?
So the woman says, I am not being acquired. Forget that. What are you supposed to do at that point? And if you do the language that if the woman by the way, I don't know of many men who want to acquire their partner. So you've got this really savage possibility that Joel was talking about at Yom Mazuti last year, and I was in the room, that not only are people saying something which isn't a reflection of their deeper meanings, but that they have achieved absolutely nothing by saying language that they do not assent to. Yeah. And that therefore, the traditional chuppah, and I feel this when people occasionally say, oh, thank you, we like you very much, Rabbi, but we're going Orthodox. Lo tofsin. You have succeeded in doing nothing. and that really you need to find something else pretty quick in a straight world. Okay, I'm going to do this reasonably quickly because I want to get on to the same sex stuff. But this is the underlying problem, and this is what has led to, in a fairly narrow world, a whole bunch of work. There is a great blog called The Kiddushin Variations. You've got to love Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, and indeed I think she's brilliant for that title, where she talks about what's kicking around in this world of options of what to do under a chuppah if you don't want to, or you physically can't get the words out of your mouth within what Joel's calling the traditionalist model. Kinyan with reciprocal declarations. I kinyan you, you kinyan me. Maimonides might say it doesn't work, but let's say by saying that we have both kinyaned the other person, that we are somehow doing something, moving from one stage to the other stage while demonstrating a kind of an egalitarian nature of what it is that we're doing.
I mean, that doesn't make sense because it's not possible for two people to both satisfy each other.
Right, but if you say that language, and by the way, I mean, I do this, as Ryan has pointed out. I don't like the word kinyan, but I'm perfectly happy with the word mekudeshet or mekudash.
Yeah.
In other words, what I think happens if you swap that mekudeshet mekudash formulation is that you demonstrate that you have not performed an act of kinyan, but you have rendered exclusive in an egalitarian manner. So actually, I quite like this. It's simpler than a lot of the other solutions that are around, and I think by sort of signposting that, it kind of works. And so just to come back to your point, that's 80% of what I do, and I do tell the other 20% this. I tell everybody this problem, but I do give them the possibility of saying that they can use the same language that everybody else believes in and not believe in it, and it will be all right. Why? Because they have intercourse with one another with the intention of becoming kinyan, kodesh, something like it. It's kind of fine. I don't go quite as far as Joel does. He's right, but I will allow people to do it. Why do they do it? The parents tend to be very, very concerned about it. I did a wedding once, and her brother is a Haredi rabbi in Jerusalem, and she just didn't want to do something in front of him. She's a fine, upstanding, pillar of non-Orthodox Jewish life, but she just didn't want to do that in front of him. I get that.
So you've got to stop compromising when you get married. Because we've got that from there on.
Yeah, and maybe that's true, but maybe the actual ceremony itself is the last time when you have responsibilities to the parents in a slightly different way. Right? Amazing verse, and therefore a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to another flesh. Like the last moment of that particular hold happens there, and anybody who's kind of had issues with what their parents were suggesting to them when they got their in-laws, that's biblical in its understanding. Let me just do this briefly. Kiddushin al Tanai, that's one idea, that you use conditions in the ketubah. You're perfectly allowed to have conditions in the ketubah. So you could do, behold, you are mekudeshet to me within you. But in the ketubah say, and by the way, in the ketubah, he picks up the obligation to sexual monogamy also.
She gets rights having sex.
Right, but there are rights in the standard ketubah, but you could put some other rights in there should you so wish. That's clearly fine. It results in the man being obligated to some of the things that the woman is obligated to, but it doesn't really destabilize the androcentricity of it. There's then use of this derech kiddushin, right? We looked at some of the possible ways that you can do this sort of half kiddushin b'safek. Sorry, I didn't look at that, but it says that if you use this kind of slightly dodgy language, you are my rib, you're my tselah, you're my other half, you complete me. It says that if you are using these in a kind of kiddush, if you are osek b'kiddushin, if you are busy with kiddushin, if you are involved in kiddushin, i.e., if she's wearing a white dress and you're standing under her chuppah and you say, you complete me, that, it's kind of okay. It's kind of okay. So that what you can do is maybe use some language which just offsets the full-on horror of the traditional Kenyan marriage, and just sort of shows that you're doing it a little bit different. And there was actually a piece on Yom Mazuti this year with a couple who've just done this, and they're very gung ho on Derek Kiddush. Daniel and Alana, and good luck to them. And they took it very, very seriously. Yeah. Surely.
Yeah.
And I've put here my favourite new ketubah language. This is from Rabbi Gordon Tucker. And what Rabbi Gordon Tucker has done is rewrite the ketubah. So instead of the wife picking up the rights that the wife picks up under a ketubah, but the man doesn't go through any change of status. That's what the ketubah kind of does. What Rabbi Gordon Tucker has done very, very cleverly is, I don't know if you can see just under the line, the blank line that's sort of about 6 lines down on the right. So he says to her, with this ring you're considering to me, and the bride says, with this ring you're considering to me. So they swap this reciprocal traditional formula. Therefore, Ryan, I think, demonstrating that they're not kinyaning each other. But the really smart thing that he does here is this second paragraph. The bride, Bill, and the groom, Sue, have accepted upon themselves all the conditions of marriage as required by the laws of Torah and the enactments of sages of our blessed memory. He hops in everything that marriage is, even though the language is so radically, is now egalitarian. Yeah, and they agree to serve and honour and support and nourish one another, rather than he agrees to do all this thing to her. So I really like this Gordon Tucker language. It's not on my own ketubah, but I would have this now if I did. All right, change of gear, and now let's look at where we are in the in terms of same-sex stuff. This is a paper that Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg wrote with massive amounts of consultation between the Masorti rabbinic group. And this came out October 2014. The Masorti rabbis have ruled that communities may carry out ceremonies for gay and lesbian couples based on shutafut or partnership ceremony. So what's a shutafut? It's a business arrangement where two people put a consideration in and come to a contractual agreement. We recognise our movement is lots of diversity. We're taking this opportunity to make our communities ever more welcoming and to realise the values of inclusion, equality and diversity within the framework of halakha. What a shutafut ceremony might include. It's based on the same moral, emotional and spiritual premises as the public affirmation of heterosexual monogamous relationships in Judaism, what we would normally call marriage. Through marriage, the commitment to a faithful, enduring, exclusive bond based on respect, love, and the express intention to establish a Jewish home and live according to the Jewish values and practice. So hopping in, Bet Ne'eman B'Yisrael, a lot of those kinds of things. There we go. Bet Ne'eman B'Yisrael. It is at heart a celebration of commitment. It marks sacred bonds. Now this is something that in particular Rabbi Jonathan, Rabbi Chaim feel very, very strongly. It differs clearly from Kinyan and Kiddushin, or the acquisition model, which forms the basis of the traditional Jewish wedding ceremony. At least for some people, for some of these, some kind of weddings that I do. In the words of Joel Levy, it's rooted in the Jewish law of partnership rather than the law of acquisition. The central act of such ceremony replaces the kinyan of Kiddushin, where the man gives an object of value to the woman with a ceremony where each partner places an object of value into a bag, which they then raise together, indicating that they enter into a joint partnership. The terms of their contract are detailed in a covenant of love, one of the terms which must be the promise of mutual sexual fidelity. So one of the things that Jonathan feels very strongly is that anybody who wants to know whether or not we do this stuff, we do this stuff. But anybody who wants to know, Masorti don't do gay weddings, gay marriage, do they? No, we don't, because we don't use the Kinyan model in same-sex ceremonies.
Jonathan spoke about that last year.
Right.
I remember him saying, because some of the challenge things that, you know, I'm now sort of second class. And he said, oh gosh, the last thing you want to do, and he started talking and getting into problems with the whole acquisition thing and heterosexual marriages. And he said, the last thing you want to do is to design something, create something with that problem, with the problem of get.
And it's not what's wanted, right? You know, I mean, so can you see where this sort of there's a sort of a Venn diagram interrelationship between the problems that are getting sort of engaged with in the heterosexual model, creating play around the same-sex model.
It's very convenient. The neighbours produce a ceremony that you walk advanced, in some respects better and more honest about what we think a relationship between a loving couple could be. And you couldn't do that if you didn't have the problems with the whole acquisition model.
I mean, you know, one of the things that's interesting about the way in which society is getting its head around gay commitment, same-sex commitment, is that it is, I think, helping us rethink issues around the heterosexual model. So, I mean, we are alive, thank you, Confucius, at a very, very interesting time.
I think that society is very largely going there around accepting the mutual rights and obligations of both the two different types of relationships, but they have the same rights and obligations to one another. What society had a big hiccup with, I don't know whether they'll get over it, is using the same language. They ran into the problem which your model avoids here. You've had marriage. The word marriage doesn't appear in it. And that, for good or ill, always associated with men and women. And many people want to know why it needs to be used in relation to the other relationship between the same sex couple. It's called it an association. Both of them.
Language is incredibly tricky. Language is incredibly tricky. I mean, next week, you know, when we're talking about this, I don't, you know, some people feel very, very strongly that they want the word marriage, and some people don't. So, you know, it's really quite complicated. But language is very important. And as a Jew, you have to feel that way. All right. I'm going to invite.
Can people who are heterosexual worship that thing?
Right. I mean, you know, this is a legal case that's going on at the moment. Yes. First instance, but that's only because. Yeah, but the court of first instance couldn't possibly have found in their favour. I mean, they just needed to go through that to get up to it's probably got to go to Europe, I think. All right, I'm going to invite Natalie to talk us. We all know them. And his father was an absolute pillar here. Zichron al-Bracha, and his mum's a member here.
Is it interesting in the Bible it says that heart is a celebration of commitment before friends, community, and I think it's called family. You know, we have families?
Yes, that's got to be a typo. I mean, that's got to be a slip. Okay, so I'm going to invite Natalie to come and to talk through what she and Sam did some time ago, 2005, 10 years ago. And do you want to?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, this is very unnerving.
You'll stop hanging in about 3 seconds.
Have you ever sat here? It's like one side of a Skype conversation and I can only see myself. That's just confusing. Okay, so thank you firstly to Rabbi Jeremy for inviting me. I'm very comfortable to just talk about my own experience. I don't think that means it's the right way that any other couple should do anything, but it was the way that we chose. Before we've passed it out, but if I could just ask you to not look for a second, which is always the risk about handing something out if you don't yet want people to look at it. It might just be worth giving a little bit of context about who we are, because that affects quite a lot about the approach that we took. So my name's Natalie, my partner's Sam. I have a sense in the Jewish gay community that actually generations are shifting continually in their expectations and their desires. So I think age is actually feels relevant. We are both 40, 142. So I give you a feel for it. I say that because I have a strong sense from talking a lot with some of the younger generation, people like 20 years younger than me, who are the current activists in organisations like Keshet, that their expectations are different from mine. Their life experience has been different. They've grown up at a different time, and mine are different from people 10 and 20 years older than me. So it feels like such a rapidly moving time. And in some ways, we were sort of pioneering in one sense, not because we intended to be, it just happened that way. And now there are people who I love for the extent to which they think we didn't do anything nearly radical enough, because they are coming from a different place 15, 20 years later. So I grew up in I went to Jewish schools all the way through. I'm from Leeds, and I went to, we were members of an Orthodox shul, but we're a very classic English Jewish family. We went to shul and then we didn't keep Shabbat in the afternoon, if that makes any sense. But I got a very good Jewish education. I went to Israel for a whole year. I studied at Bar Ilan. We're very Israel Zionist family, and I learned a lot of Jewish law. By the time I left my year out in Israel, I had the ability to learn Gemara, study text. Halakha was very serious, so it was. I'm from a family and from a background where Halakha and Jewish learning was very important to me. And I arrived in London off the back of all that, having gone to university in 1997. In 1997, I met my partner Sam, and Sam is an Edgware girl through and through, brought up in Edgware United, B'nai Akiva, went on her year out to Israel with B'nai Akiva. This is relevant because she comes from a very traditional family. My family politically is a socially liberal left-wing family, and very politically active and very engaged liberal family, and Sam's is from a different generation and a religiously and socially conservative background. So we were coming from that context, and when we met, we were both Shomer Shabbat, absolutely Shomer Kashrut, didn't eat in any restaurant that wasn't a kosher restaurant, and so on. So this is all relevant to therefore to the approach that we took in this. So we met in 1997 at Limud, and it was a long journey through from there till the point at which we held a ceremony of some sort. It's not so much relevant to the text, but I do think it's probably not surprising to many of you. I think if we were a straight couple, like many of our friends who met their partners at around the same time, we'd have probably got engaged after 12 or 18 months, and we'd have got married after 2 or 3 years, and that would have all been at the same point as all the rest of our friends. We were in our mid-20s, it was all very predictable, but it didn't actually, because there was so much more having our families get so used to each other and so used to the idea before we came to have a ceremony. So the point at which we had a ceremony was actually about 8 or 9 years after we met. And that was very long delay, but it was worth it, absolutely worth it, because the benefit of that time was that by the time we got to have the ceremony, I feel very emotional saying this, that both my parents and Sam's father walked us in, stood under the chuppah. Sam's father, who was a Cohen, did the Cohen bracha for us, and so that's sociological rather than halachic, but it also pertains to the continual need to have the ceremony feel something that was acceptable to all the family. You talked about that before, but that was coming from us, and also from a constant consideration of making sure that everybody felt comfortable. Nobody who came to that ceremony, including us, had ever been to a same-sex ceremony, and so it was totally new context for absolutely everybody. So I think that's all the sort of sociological stuff. Let's have a look into the text. So I have these books, which are these are the same thing as the text you have in front of you, but this is just the sort of beautiful looking version. So we made these. We spent, I say it took 8 years because we were waiting for our families to be ready, but it was also because actually it was a wonderful project to have to design for ourselves a ceremony. In one sense, there wasn't like an off-the-shelf version and then any variation to it we had to argue about. It was a blank sheet of paper, and actually that really, really suited us to be able to be completely creative and do absolutely everything that we wanted to. I think the best thing to do is actually to look in the introduction, because we wrote Oh, I'm used to this being like a siddur, so it goes right to left, and this is left to right.
Sorry.
It's okay. So I think, why don't we just read this as text? I mean, I've taught this before as text, and actually it can be quite good like that. So, because we wrote it all out, so we may as well just read it in that way. So if you go to page 2, so if you just go to the journey so far, would somebody read out from the journey so far, and then we'll take paragraph by paragraph and talk about it.
Once we had decided to take the big step, major questions loomed about the form, and indeed the title of our ceremony. We both wanted a ceremony that would mean something halachically, i.e. that incorporated some sort of legal obligations between us. This set it apart from some ceremonies designed by other couples, which contained beautiful readings, songs, and poems that felt like a school or read from multiple texts.
As a ceremony.
On the other hand, we were always clear that the ceremony should not take the form of the traditional Jewish wedding we use Islam.
So thank you. So let's just stop there. So one of the things we immediately excluded, because it just didn't feel like the tradition that we came from in our relationship to halakha, was to just take the existing ceremony and to change some of the pronouns. Many couples do that within a different denomination. That's a very well rehearsed, absolutely standard way of running a wedding. And we met with rabbis who were very happy to do that ceremony for us, and rabbis we liked, but didn't come from our tradition. By this point, it's worth saying we were deeply engaged in the Asif minyan within New North London, and had really made our communal home inside New North London and inside the Muslim movement. And that was a great place to be in terms of something that felt like the right way to take forward our relationship with halakha. So we immediately excluded just taking the traditional ceremony, but that left the question of what to do instead. Would you carry on? Thank you.
The other key decision in developing our ceremony was the question of whether to embrace any of the traditional Jewish marriage rituals and symbols. Those with halachic relevance, i.e. formal processes for eretzin and nisuin, or the legal processes described within the ketubah, were immediately excluded.
So thank you. So what we're taking out is using the traditional language of the ketubah, because our sense was it was not meant for us, and also, as we've discussed, it's rife with problems anyway, so why take it? On the other hand, as we'll come to, having a ketubah on the wall, the same as all of our straight friends have, felt like somewhere we wanted to get to. So the question was, okay, so then what's in it? Yeah. But we were not doing the Kiddushin model that we've looked at, not the Erusin Nisun. Okay.
However, the poignancy and power of the music, symbols, and rituals of the traditional wedding ceremony was such that we concluded that they would key to locating this ceremony within the ritual tradition of couples establishing together as Jewish couples.
Okay, so one of the things we thought about a lot was that actually, if you ask many people who are not halachically, deeply engaged, the vast majority of people who would recognise a Jewish wedding if they saw one, if you say to them, what makes a Jewish wedding? They say, there's a chuppah, there's some circling, they break a glass, right? But all those sorts of things. And actually, as we've just looked in the text, none of those particularly mark the halachic part of what's happened. There's a debate about chuppah, I recognise. So some rabbis would have had us not have a chuppah, and we thought a lot about that. And we read a lot and learned a lot, and we did a lot of learning, which was a wonderful gift to do as part of this process. So chuppah, I think, is possibly doubt on this question, but many of the other things, certainly the circling is entirely just additional minhag, not halachic. The particular choice of songs, the breaking of the glass, they're all very symbolic, but actually, one of the things we were trying to mediate was the sort of sociological question again. How do you have people feel like they're at something inside a tradition? How do people attend something and go, I feel at home here, this is my religion, this is my tradition, and more than that, I'm sure what I'm supposed to do here, right? What we didn't want to do was have some sort of event where actually everybody was on edge, and that our parents' friends were there, not just our generation, but our parents' friends were there, and for them to have accepted the invitation and then come and go, this is all very frightening, this is all very horrible, this is just weird. Actually, there were lots of things that it took to make it just go, oh, this is like the most boring Jewish wedding I've ever been to. In one sense, as boring as we could make it, that was going to make it feel really familiar. And yet, we didn't, and so for that reason, actually, Davka, we went the opposite direction. We had it as black tie, because that was all, you know, all how serious and boring and like familiar and traditional can you make it? Because that helps everybody know, oh, I know what to do here. I'm safe and I'm okay. So let's just read this last couple of paragraphs, and then I'll just go through with you quickly what the different components of the ceremony were. Are you happy to carry on reading? Thank you.
Ultimately, our guiding principle has been Rav Kook's injunction to make the oath new and the new holy. In practice, this means that we are using within our new ceremony many of those elements of the Jewish wedding that are not locked as part of the process of the marriage, but are symbols and rituals that have become part of the wedding ceremony through multiple traditions. Thus, the ceremony takes place under a kuppah. We circle each other upon entering the kuppah. We listen to hymns and stamp on a glass at the end of the ceremony, and we retain the luxury and importance of spending a few minutes together, taking it all in after the ceremony being together. Although it's precisely these factors which will characterize a Jewish wedding for many people, they are symbolic of holding overlapped community. We therefore decided that we felt comfortable with the drawing on and incorporating these symbols, which tie us into centuries-old Jewish tradition and community.
Thank you. And that's so. The last paragraph, that's specifically about the ceremony itself. The last paragraph just talks about all the other bits of ritual and ceremony that go around a wedding, where we also made versions of them for ourselves. So the last paragraph. Thank you.
Other symbols appear in adaptable. There is no bedecking, but instead a new ritual in which we immediately before the ceremony and make our final preparation.
So bedecken. Thank you. Bedecken in a straight heterosexual ceremony is the point where the groom comes in, and there's the process with the veil. We actually weren't wearing veils because we tried standing in front of the mirror both wearing veils, and we looked really silly. They were like, so actually it was a constant question of how, what does this look like? So we didn't wear veils, so we couldn't do bedecken in that sense, but actually Rabbi Shoshana Boyd-Gelfand, who's both a very good friend and now a member of New North London and a conservative rabbi by background, did the most beautiful bedecken equivalent ceremony for us, which involved its own rituals, which in fact involved taking each other's jewellery off each other. So we were wearing earrings and bracelets and stuff, and we went through this very beautiful ritual of taking them off each other, partly as a way of demonstrating in the equivalent of the bedecken, of saying, I'm not marrying you for your wealth and your assets, but for my choice to be with you, stripped bare of the diamonds, and that was very beautiful. And she also incorporated a tradition that she uses, I think, in straight weddings as well, of involving parents. So that thing you were saying before about it's the point at which you leave your parents and cleave to another person. And there was a point in this where, in our bedecken ceremony, where our parents took an item of clothing off us, a sort of shrug thing, and took it away from us, and we gave it to them and said thank you, and it was very, very beautiful. So the creating something that was involved some of the same processes, but was not halakhically recreating, a veil-related ceremonies. Okay.
Nothing of the ketubah, but a star Greek, a contract of covenant with wording that we had devised ourselves. 7 blessings will be recited under the kuppah, not the traditional 7 brachot, but 7 brachot from elsewhere in Jewish practice that we have selected for this moment. The incorporation of these traditions, together with the inclusion of Tehillim, Psalms, and other prayers, seeks to make this new ceremony into a ritual possessing production of that holiness.
Thank you for reading all of that. So let's just stand back from the text for a minute. So we called our ceremony a Brit Ahava, and that means a covenant of love. It is the term that a very important writer, Rachel Adler, has created, and we used some of her model, but not all of it. And it's the term that turns up in the Masorti Rabbi's statement of a covenant of love. So we wrote then in the next couple of pages, and I think you're welcome to take this away, right, Jeremy? That a covenant actually felt Davka opposed to acquisition, a covenant between us, in other words, an agreement, a contract, something we chose to enter into, felt like actually a very beautiful way. And when we came to write our ketubah, which we'll see, what we did was really play with the concept of Brit, and in our own learning we looked at all the references to the concept of Brit, of covenant that occurred in Torah, and looked at what particular type of covenant, what was this, and how does that reflect the nature of the relationship between us. So we took that concept of Brit not just as a name that somebody else had made, but as something that could say something really meaningful and unique to us about the nature of the relationship we wanted to build between us. So let's just look through. We'll go across the pages and just look at the actual ceremony. So on page 6, that's where actually we described. This was a book we gave out to people that they were reading and that they had and they took away with them. So we did again things that are familiar, like that we fasted. Actually, it was Rosh Chodesh, but it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so we still fasted. We had mincha. We were in separate rooms. We did the same thing. We didn't see each other for 24 hours. We had a Shabbat together with all our family and friends away in Knersborough in this big castle where we held the thing. And then we separated at Havdalah through till the Sunday. So again, some of those similar rituals, which again felt like they were locating us in tradition and not making a massive distinction between us and what we'd seen all of our friends, straight friends, go through. And at Mincha, we both said the Vidui, the Confession of Yom Kippur, again is as traditional. So many of these things, which actually were all part of the package, felt entirely available to us. And in one sense, I was it felt really important to me doing the Vidui of Yom Kippur. That was a hugely important moment for me, much more important than what actually happened under the chuppah. So what we didn't do was go to mikveh. We had a big discussion about would either of us or both of us or together, and we didn't go to mikveh. We actually concluded again that was just a stretch too far for us, but for many other people it might have been, and maybe we'd say something different now.
Why did mikveh? What was the stretch?
In really practical terms, that the Masorti mikveh just didn't feel like a very inviting place, because it's just not particularly beautiful and luxurious compared to some of the. I have friends who live in Hendon who observe Tara Mishpacha, who go to mikveh every month, and they go to these beautiful, lovely spa-type places in Hendon and Golders Green, which are really lovely. But I wouldn't really be welcomed without making up a story which absolutely wasn't prepared to give about the context in which I was there. I mean, I could have just said I'm a bride, but actually that's not authentic. I'd be holding so much back that wouldn't be right. So in one sense that would be it. If there had been a way of doing it in a place that felt like it actually would be lovely, I may well have done it. Actually, we may well have done it. But you get a flavour of like all the questions that occurred, and actually what was going to happen under chuppah was only one such a small part of all these different questions of what would we do. And actually it doesn't come up in the booklet and we'll have gone off into another thing by then, but just after the ceremony, the other big question that again immediately occurred was we were part of a chevra, of a community where people generally did 7 days of Sheva Brachot, and it was a great opportunity for parties every night and for different families and friends to host Sheva Brachot, and that felt absolutely natural to us to do. And so we had our full 7 nights. We were, once we waited 8 years, we were in this. It was, 120 people, black tie, a castle, and 7 nights of Sheva Brachot. So it had sociologically, and for us as an experience, it had all of the incredibly reinforcing and affirming and wonderful aspects that being married within a community I see have for people. So we talk about the Deccan equivalent that we had. We walked in. All these tiny questions. Who walks in first if it's an egalitarian ceremony? Our solution to that was that we had 2 aisles, and in fact I'd seen straight couples do this. So we arranged the room so that we had a block of seats in the middle and then 2 blocks of seats on the outside and 2 aisles. So one of us, Sam, walked in with her father and then waited at the bottom of the steps. We had this beautiful, imagine a big castle, huge flight of steps we came down. Stood at the bottom, Sam stood at the bottom, and then I walked in with my parents, but we both waited, and then when we both walked down at the same time. So these were all part of if you're going to make the halachic part egalitarian, then there's other questions. Why would the groom stand there and wait for his bride to arrive? You could do it the other way around. So if you then go to, there's lots of songs. We were really focused on music, but that's less relevant for now. Okay, so on the top of page 10, we incorporated walking around each other, but again, that needed to be egalitarian. So we, instead of doing 7 circles, we did 3.5 each. Actually, right, it takes a lot of practice to do 3.5 circles and end up in the right place and facing in the right direction. And actually, it's quite nice, because what happened was what you have to do, in case you ever want to do this, is you walk in and you face the direction you've walked in, like with your back to the audience, community, and then you each do your 3.5 circles, and you will end up facing the front. So that's how we did it. Yeah, there's a lot of choreography involved. You have to be slightly to the right and facing the wrong way. No, one first and then the other one. So then we get into the actual core of the ceremony. We decided to start off with wine. As it says, all Jewish moments of celebration begin with the blessing and drinking of wine. Seemed to us a very easy to pull in. Let's start off with wine, always a good start. And again, it's part of the Jewish ceremony, but we were not doing it in the place or in the way that it would be part of in a traditional heterosexual ceremony. We then had the sort of Devar Torah, and then we get into the real heart of the covenant process. So the term Shtar Brit means contract of covenant, and it was our equivalent of a ketubah. So I'm at the second paragraph of page 12. And so I need to sort of get the order right about how to explain this. We decided that in the context of everything we've read about the traditional ceremony, we absolutely were not acquiring each other, so there was no kinyan of that form. The question we took to the rabbis, we were very lucky to have a sort of group of 2 or 3 rabbis, actual various denominations and particular different takes working with us, all without meeting each other, just by to some extent in secret. And the question we asked them was, how would 2 people form a contract, right? Only lawyers in the room. I'm not acquiring property here. I just want to enter into a contract. That's quite a normal legal thing to do. So what would be the process to do that? And that was the question we asked them. Just what would be Jewish law to do that? And so the answer that was produced to us was this process, which actually is called kinyan, but the other form of kinyan. So
the kinyan is over the consideration, not the person, not the party.
Right. Yeah. So what happened? What happens is, if you look on page, just trying to work out where it best explains this. Okay, so sorry, excuse me a second. Let me just find the right page. Okay, so top of page 18. I'll explain actually what the kinyan was. In practical terms, we had the reading out of the Shtar Brit, which was our equivalent of the ketubah. That was like the reading out of the contract first, and then we entered into the contract. So to explain the halachic context, as we've said, the kinyan is familiar, but it's from a traditional Jewish wedding ceremony, but in that context it means acquisition. So in the second paragraph, however, there's a second form of kinyan in which the person who performs the kinyan obligates himself or herself to do or perhaps refrain from doing a certain act. Indeed, in halakha, a kinyan is the primary legal mechanism by which parties can bind themselves to the future performance of an act. And that was the particular distinction that we were making here. A mere promise to perform an act is not legally binding. It is this function of kinyan as the acceptance of obligations that forms the heart of our ceremony. So I think if you asked, as we were saying before, if you ask many getting married couples, what do you think you're doing in this ceremony? They might well say, well, I think I'm entering into a set of obligations to do this and not to do this. And that's what we wanted to do. So the practicality of what we did was that we, rather than a man giving a woman a ring as a way of offering her something which must be of a certain value, because actually it's the buying that ring is illustrating. What we did was we chose an act which happened to be a ring, because that again felt sensible, like natural in a lay understanding of a wedding. But the act of choosing to pick up a ring from somebody's hand, which we both did to each other, was the way in which we demonstrated our entry into the Brit Ahava that we had agreed. So what we did was we set out the Brit, the covenant, with all its terms. Those were read out in Hebrew and in English publicly, so that everybody knew exactly what the terms were that we were entering into. And then essentially it was the equivalent of the Christian version of do you take. So do you agree to enter into the terms of the contract that was just read out? If you do, pick up the ring. Do you also agree to enter into the terms of the contract that you just heard read out? If yes, pick up the ring. So that was the process halachically that we used. The words of the shtar Brit of the contract are all there, and given everything we've said about how actually there are problems with the traditional forms of language in the heterosexual ceremony, the opportunity, as you see on page 16 and 17, to really make this a set of commitments that felt totally unique and personal to us was just an extraordinary opportunity. We produced this by actually sitting in our front room, and we almost played a game when we started. We got 2 blank sheets of paper and we sat at opposite sides of the room and we said, let's write down the commitments we should be making to each other. And it literally started from there, and then we looked at where those particular types of commitments would be reflected in Torah. So you see, for example, the covenant of protection, like the rainbow in the sky, that's described as a Brit in Torah. So we use that pasuk. It's a covenant of exclusivity, like the Brit between God and Israel. You shall be my people and I shall be your God. That's another place where the Brit term is used. So I'm on middle of page 16. It's a covenant of devotion, joining hearts, like the covenant between Jonathan and David. So each time we brought a pasuk, and it felt, again, given that we had learned and we were familiar with text, to be in a context where actually there was the Hebrew kept saying shenema, da 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 da, shenema. It way more than whether there was kiddushin. For us, that felt like we were deeply, deeply rooted in this tradition, this text-based tradition. So we brought these 3 psukim about Noah and the rainbow, about God and the people, about Jonathan and David, and we then also actually wanted to put in what would happen if this relationship ended. So after you see there's 5 versions of Brit in here. We made all sorts of declarations that you don't get to make if you're just using a traditional ketubah. So we said things like, we declare our commitment to maintain a Jewish home, to participate in Jewish learning, to serve our community, to work towards the collective task to kun olam, as it is said, tzedek tirdov. So we were able to make all those commitments. But the very last paragraph, I think, is just worth looking at. So this is penultimate. And we recognise the wisdom of our tradition, more counsel, more understanding. We will strive to listen, understand, and respect one another. Should a problem become too difficult to solve ourselves, we will seek wise counsel. But if our ways should part, we will act with decency and respect in accordance with the terms of our pre-covenantal agreement, making paramount the interests of any children with which we have been blessed. So we were able, I think, as a result of the degree of innovation here, actually to do something within Jewish tradition in many ways, and yet to make it something that I think many heterosexual couples would massively benefit from doing. So that was all read out in Hebrew and English, and then we each held the ring on each hand, and we chose, again, this is the opportunity to just make it as rich and beautiful as we could. As we picked up the rings, we said the words from Ruth that Naomi and Ruth say to each other. So we learnt off by heart, and we said to each other that in Hebrew, where you go, I will go, your people will be my people, where you die, I will die, etc. And again, that felt utterly out of tradition. And we did have witnesses. We had another interesting discussion about if if in some world that is hard to imagine, but it may be possible, somehow we were ever in front of an Orthodox Bet Din, and somehow we were asking an Orthodox Bet Din to make some decisions about division of property or custody of children or any of those sorts of things, or in any way support us with a process of separation, that somehow, this you can see the sort of convolution of our thinking here, that it would be important to have two male witnesses, because actually what we had done was try to create a binding Orthodox, it recognised an Orthodox halakha covenant between us. So regardless of actually whatever else might be the sociological context, that actually is just two people who've made a contract that would be recognised by Orthodox halakha, that actually similarly, that would, for it to be, even just any contract needs to be witnessed by two Adim. So we actually had 4 witnesses, 2 married heterosexual couples, all of whom signed our document, which is up on our wall, and but 2 of them were men. So that it, and in one sense that sounds all bonkers to like, but there's this playing, which feels such a Masorti thing to do, between how can we achieve this end, which actually even just the saying of it would sound utterly radical and unthinkable to some people, and yet we're constantly going, oh, let's think about who our witnesses are. Some people, when we talk about this, say this all seems mad. Why on earth? Some people from more progressive background, when they hear us describe this, say, I just don't understand. Why did you go to such trouble? And I get why that would be a very good question to ask. You're falling over yourself here to fall in with a tradition that has excluded you. That's one way of describing what we did. But it doesn't particularly feel like that in a way which I think speaks to people who are choosing to be in the Masorti community, because actually it's the constant tension and battle of how do I make this as rich and authentic as possible and support what wants to be a genuine expression of a new thing that couldn't exist before. That is pretty much it, I think. That was the end of our ceremony. We then sang Tehillim and walked out.
You didn't do the Shabbat Boker.
Ah, sorry, we didn't cover. I think it's because Jeremy didn't photocopy them.
Sorry.
It's Jeremy's fault. It's thank you for. Is it okay to answer that?
Please.
So yes, thank you. We said in the introduction. Again, we felt like, what makes a Jewish wedding? Shabbat brachot. Everyone knows there's the Shabbat brachot. But it really, probably almost more than anywhere else. You know, you'll notice we didn't use the words Harei Makudeshet Li, because again, that felt like it was not meant for us. There's no point. It doesn't feel right to us to just appropriate it and say it is. And perhaps even more so because it's a bracha, and especially Sam, my very Edgeway United partner, would say it's a bracha levatalai. It's a bracha used inappropriately and take God's name in vain. So we didn't take the standard 7 Shabbat brachot, but we did something that felt much more wonderful, which was we said, what are the 7 brachot that are favourite brachot? What are my favourite brachot? So we said Shechachianu, like obviously, of course you say Shechachianu, like just seemed so sensible, so obvious. The second one we said was Hatov v'Hametiv, the bracha that you say on hearing good news. Again, or on a wonderful thing happening. We then said Sha'asani Kirtzono, so the bracha that traditionally that a woman says in Birkat HaShachar in the morning, Shacharit, of thank you God for making me as I am. We went, right, we're having one of those, because here this doesn't just mean thank God for making me a woman, it means and for making us who we are in every sense of it. So there was a lot of
I'm not that familiar, but is that the same one as saying thank you for not making me a man, or is it a different?
It is that.
Okay, so you use the very controversial thank God for making me a man as a central bracha in your bracha.
Well, the men say thank you for making me a man.
Yeah.
Sorry, men say thank you for not making me a woman, and women traditionally say She'asani Kirtzono.
Okay, yeah. So it's that one, but you use it as a central bracha.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Who has made me according to his will. In other words, God wanted me to be this way. It's fine.
That's a good affirmation.
Yeah. Then we did one out of the standard Shabbat brachot, which is the one that felt most powerful, and we felt like we were not saying it. Here's all the sort of thinking. We were not saying it because it's one of the Sheva brachot. We're saying it because actually the words of it felt like a genuine bracha for us, like as a relevant thing. So that's Asher Yatsa et Adam B'Talmud, B'Tselem Demut Tavnito, and it's on the same theme. Thank you, God, for who's created humanity in your own image. In other words, we recognise, despite the experience of Jewish gay people over many, many decades or centuries of being told, God couldn't have made you this way, and you're not, this is unnatural, or all those other words that people might have used. Actually, that what we're saying is, no, God made me, and I have B'Tselem Elokim. I'm also made in God's image. So again, it's all about reaffirmation. But they're also just, that sounds very terribly progressive when I use that language. It's all affirmation and reclaiming. That's true politically, but it's also, which are our favourite brachot. Like I think it's good for all human beings to keep reaffirming their purity. I'll get into a different. Then we said, so on the next bracha that we did is the bracha that you say on seeing blossom for the first time in a year. So you can only say it, for the first time you can say it in any year is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and this was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And my beloved Edgware United partner, it's her favourite bracha from when she was a small girl. Is the bracha on seeing blossom for the first time. And so we were having it in the spring, and there was blossom everywhere. And so when my sister, who is from and had her head covered, stood under the chuppah, and we got some real blossom, and she made sure she had not said it yet that year, and she said it for the first time under the chuppah. All of these were said by our family members, including my grandpa, who was 99 at the time, my dad, Sam's brother, my sister. So that was the one on saying, because actually the bracha on blossom is beautiful. Just listen. Blessed is God, King of the universe, who has withheld nothing from his world, but has created in it good creatures and good trees for the enjoyment of human beings. It's just beautiful. The sixth one was Shmor Tzeitzenu Uva. Again, just a piece of tefillah that is so powerful.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So the next one is a piece of tefillah, of text that might be familiar to many of you. Shmor Tzeitzenu Uvo'enu L'chaim L'shalom Me'atav Ve'od Olam. Safeguard our coming and going for life and for peace from now to eternity. Ufros Aleinu Sukat Shlomecha. The one thing we never got around to in all the massive work of creating a wedding was that we wanted written over Rachoka, Ufros Aleinu Sukat Shlomecha. Like, make this the safety, make this the official translation.
Spread out over us.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But something about that being so held and being so supported, which was absolutely how the event felt to us. So blessed are you who spreads the shelter of peace upon us, upon all of his people in Israel, upon Jerusalem. And then the last one was Tfilat Haderech, the bracha that you say on going on a journey, which again just felt so completely obvious. Of course, this is the beginning of your journey. We've been together for 8 years, but there's an awful lot more, hopefully, to come after that. So again, it's an example of taking the framework of the Sheva Brachot and not just taking what's written, but saying what would be the right Sheva Brachot for us. And what we did was, when we had the 7 nights afterwards of celebration, we also had Sheva Brachot. So thank you for the question.
That is just like anyone, if other people use your form of service,
Not that I know of in England, but in the States, yes, I know 2 or 3 couples who've used it. We haven't published it anywhere, precisely because actually I think the halachic part of the core of it is not that different from what exists in other places. And all the bits that feel really moving to me are moving because they're ours, because they're about what Sam's favourite bracha about blossom shouldn't make it anybody else's bracha that turns up. It feels to me like precisely if some turned up in somebody else's ceremony and they say, oh, that's what gay weddings have, they have a bracha about blossom, then we'd have lost something, right? That's not what this is about.
So do you sort of see that everyone was, well, I'm sure this goes for heterosexual couples as well. that they would sort of do their own sort of format within certain parameters.
I would say it was a wonderful experience for us. It required huge amounts of time and study and learning, and we were very lucky to know and to have access to people who would spend a lot of time with us learning and checking and writing things. And we wrote our Shtabrit in English, and then we spent a lot of time learning to find the Psukim and the Torah, and then friends translated it into modern Hebrew, and other friends, so that wouldn't be possible for everybody, and nor would everybody want to spend, a year pretty much working on that ceremony. But I don't know, if there was a way of making people or supporting them to do it, then irrelevant of their sexuality, I thought that alone was great.
There's another question I got on the observation actually. On page 6, your third paragraph, you say to symbolise the protection that we promise to each other in our Shtabrit. We will wrap each wrap the other in a covenant we will wear under the chuppah.
Yeah.
Now my heterosexual granddaughter had a ceremony in 2007.
Yeah.
And when they did this, I must say the older generation somewhat gasped. They found that was, I think, I wouldn't say a bridge too far, but it was very unexpected because no one had actually prepared them for it. I'm talking about 2000, I'm talking about 9 years ago, and that was...
So what did they wrap each other in?
It looked like a tallit. It wasn't like the one that you get in the box outside. It was sort of purpose, it was individually design. Right. But what did you actually do? Is that a similar thing?
No, it was 2 women. There was an opportunity for lots of nice dressmaking activity to go on. We did the mincha and the reception, the opening reception when we were in separate rooms, and we went into our Bedecken wearing a like a fur shawl thing, basically, like a really, really nice fur stole. You know those fur stoles, the horizontal line around here. So then we took those off each other. That was the taking off part, and our parents took them off and took them away. And then we wrapped each other in a piece of silk each. So no, there wasn't actually a tallit involved. There happened to just be fur and silk. We didn't wear a tallit. We do both wear tallit in shul. And actually, one of the questions we asked ourselves was, did we want to wear tallit? And again, we were thinking a lot about those people for whom actually just being at a same-sex ceremony was already so much of a step, which was true for lots of people, that it was really important not to do anything which visually would affront people. So there were lots of things that we just looked and thought, that's just going to make people uncomfortable, and it's not in anybody's interests to make anybody uncomfortable. So the halacha, actually many of the people who were there didn't understand or care about the halacha, but they would have cared about things that made them feel uncomfortable, and that was just as important.
That was what the problem was. I think basically with Mrs. Redding, it was very difficult with some parts of it. It didn't seem to flow. I don't know quite how they ran. But I think that was because it was early days, but it was organised by Joel Levy. It was rather unknown at the time.
Right. So I think this is again utterly sociological and nothing about the halacha, which is just how can you support people for whom this is a big step to feel okay with this, and actually, as the rabbis absolutely have the job, which they've been done wonderfully for the Masorti community, of helping us to work out the halachic way through that. But actually, there'll be many other things that need really, really subtle negotiation in order to not have anybody around feel that somehow this has been uncomfortable, whilst also keeping the couple feeling that they've had the ceremony that they want. And I don't think it's up to our rabbis to work that out. I think the rabbis have to work out the halachic part of it.
Have you had criticism from friends who were there? Not from friends. From friends or family members that they felt you made a joke about it. Or any kind of criticism?
No, because this is being recorded, I won't say much more about this. But there were some people who we invited and we never expected to come, and that was fun. There was no need to make anybody be in the room if actually that felt wrong to them. But yes, we do absolutely have both family members and parents' friends, not our friends. I sort of guess they wouldn't have been our friends if they were going to feel uncomfortable. But my parents, very, very good friends, absolutely, and family members, close family members who chose not to.
It's just so shit when I do a ton of heterosexual marriages,
Yeah.
and so much of what you're talking about plays out anyway. I talk people through the whole sociological side of it to make sure they know how hard they have to work to make that stuff work. Because the number of times there's an issue of maybe the in-laws didn't like this, or they applied for legal conversion candidate but actually was a proper Jew, or these kinds of things play out all the time. So every wedding is a gentle dance, this kind of stuff, and I think what's so beautiful is to sort of feel the way in which you thought this through. And my experience of people finding difficulty in ceremonies is that the difficulty eases with two things. One is if they feel the integrity with which a person has approached it, which I think you can't help but feel. How many pages is the full document?
It's all of that, although it does include benching.
Right.
But it's a lot of writing. There's more writing that you haven't got.
Right. And the other thing that really helps is the passage of time to develop grandkids, right?
Yeah.
But actually, if you do make it to 10 years and many more and everything else, with a couple of kids who seem to be growing up, loving Judaism and being quite normal, the people are persuaded through the reality of a lived life, and I think that time works very powerfully also.
I wish I was there.
Thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to recall it. Thank you for the opportunity to think about it.
Yes, a huge thank you to Natalie for coming in and for kind of sort of, bearing your soul. A quick refuah shlema to Sam, who's kind of with medical issue, which we wish gets speedily resolved and properly as well. I'm not going to go through the last page of my handout in any detail. It's what the CJLS, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards that we talked about last week, came up with as one of two options. And the reason why I've included it in your handout is to show this very different way of doing it, which is basically you take everything that you can get from a contemporary, from a heterosexual Jewish marriage model, and you use as much of it as you possibly can. So the Sheva Brachot are absolutely the standard Sheva Brachot, minus the little bits that you couldn't possibly apply. You get the Harei Art. I've given you the lesbian one as opposed to the gay one. You get the Harei Art followed by the Harei Art, and you get the sort of the wine functioning not as, well, if it's a bit of a party, let's have a glass of wine, but the wine of the traditional Brachot Kiddushin, the Kiddushin blessing of a heterosexual marriage. So just to sort of show you that, and actually one of the things that you alluded to a little bit, Natalie, when we were talking a couple of weeks ago about this, was what would you be doing if you were doing this now? And you spoke about avoiding some of the classic elements of halachic heterosexual marriage. And I don't know how much, if you were starting all over again, you would sort of steer around those things, or you'd adopt. I mean, it's all hugely at play at the moment. Virtually, I suppose, almost by definition, people who want to do this within a Masorti framework get quite excited by the kinds of things that were exciting you. We'll avail ourselves of this, we'll reclaim that, we'll avoid this, we'll use that. And so there's a lot of creativity that's happening around this. And actually, I think some of it is sparking creativity in heterosexual coupling as well. And that's no.
Yeah, the only British people I know who use any aspects of the structure of heterosexual. We think not the core halachic parts around the actual form of contract, but other things that we just thought to come up with that have made their way into other heterosexual constituencies.
And it's part of what I think is the sort of the best of Masorti. thoughtful, critical, historically sensitive, engaged in the halachic system, and we're in a very interesting time.
The only thing I'd say, I don't know what we would do now, but we're 40-something, and the 20-somethings I know, and the 30-somethings I know, even those who are, again, coming in the same sort of relationship to halakha, are less apologetic than we are. Probably for good, but it's not where I am, which actually makes me feel quite old when I think. So they in the same situation.
You're apologetic and substitute understanding.
Maybe.
I mean, this is one of the things that Louis felt. We talked about this last week in terms of Rabbi Joel Roth. Rabbi Joel Roth doesn't think that he's moved at all, but the world has changed around him. He still thinks of himself as the man who wrote the original tshuva of women being allowed to become rabbis. He thinks of himself as this sort of, pioneering liberal, despite the fact, the times change. Okay, that'll do for today.